My name is Juliana Carlevaris, and I run Project Nowhere.
So, Juliana, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I wanted to start by asking you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do behind the festival. I understand that you wear many hats.
Yeah, I definitely wear many hats. With the festival, there's a small team of us. I do a lot of the curation, so I would be the artistic director for the festival, and we really all, it's a small team and it's a big effort. So we all step into many roles in doing it. But, programming decisions related to like marketing, budget, programming, we really all make those together. And I think there's maybe I oversee a lot of it. But yeah, with a small team, we kind of, a lot of those roles overlap. And that's how we get it done. Yeah.
For sure. We operate very similarly at Also Cool, so we can definitely relate to small team and kind of like a musical chairs operation.
Totally.
I wanted to ask on the side of the curation, if you can speak a little bit more to what kind of music the festival highlights and what inspires your curatorial direction.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the things that makes the festival stand out in the landscape of local festivals here and across Canada. We definitely lean into the left field a little bit. There are things that are, it's not completely out there or super inaccessible, but, genre wise, we don't really consider ourselves to be a genre specific festival, but we definitely lean into a lot of heavy stuff like psych, post-punk, hardcore, but electronic stuff that is a little bit eclectic, like really a mix between DJs and live sets, just things that are a little bit left of center and not the most mainstream. And really it's curated just based on our tastes and shows that we've seen that we find exciting and things that maybe feel a little bit underrepresented in the scope of festivals that are around right now. So yeah, we definitely dig into the underground. And there's a strong focus on local art too, and emerging artists that are from Toronto or even from Toronto adjacent markets like Montreal, Ottawa, and even like some from the States. So that's representing those artists and across genres is really important to us too.
Very cool. And of course, the lineup stood out to us this year as it did last year. We feel like Project Nowhere definitely represents the artist's artist. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you listen and discover new music, which is something we're always curious to ask fellow curators.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that you said the artist because a big part of the festival is that pretty much everybody that works on it is an artist or a touring crew, and we definitely take that experience and put it into the festival experience to kind of like see it through the lens of the artists that are playing it in a way. But in terms of how I'm discovering music for this, it varies. Like I have other, obviously I recently left my booking agent position at Mothland, but through that job, I was going, attending a lot of industry events, South by, M for Montreal, really like festivals that are designed for discovering their platform for discovering new artists. And I have a lot of great, friends who are DJs that like put me on to a lot of great new music. Just generally like, through the community, like word of mouth, that stuff I think goes really far. And I go to a lot of shows. I really like attend as many shows as possible. I also book a venue called the Garrison in Toronto. So I find out, who's coming through and check out as many shows locally as possible. I'll also go to festivals where I find the curation interesting and like, could travel to maybe like Levitation in Austin or, something like that and just kind of take in as much as I can. And I love seeing things live before, obviously, the experience that we're selling is a live experience. So I love to check things out live and in person. And same with the rest of the people that work on the fest. And we're all kind of like hyping things up behind the scenes to each other too. We're like, oh, we saw this show, it was crazy. Did you hear about this? To me, that's the most important way to discover stuff is just like other people being stoked on it, because then you can only imagine like a lot more people are going to be stoked on it if you bring it out in the right context.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like word of mouth is endlessly going to be one of the best ways to discover new favorite artists. And I'll ask you a little bit more about the Garrison later, but what you said about how the festival is designed from an artist's perspective, or people that are working in production behind festivals, for example. We've spoken before about how the festival centers artist care, and you've told me about, for example, how Project Nowhere offers non-alcoholic options in green rooms. And I wanted to ask you if, as a musician yourself, if you could shed light on how you developed your artist first approaches with the festival.
Yeah, I think, well, in a sense it came, pretty naturally, because you think when you're building a festival, just generally as a curator, you're curating things that you would want to see as somebody that goes to shows or as a music lover. And I think the artist side, it's always there, and that experience is just really naturally informs the kind of like environments and that you're creating for artists to come into, the experience you're creating for artists, because you have that kind of like, so much of your life is just doing that. And so things like knowing the value of, wherever possible, like a proper sound check. Yeah, it goes from like production quality to hospitality and stuff, right? So it's like, sound checks, trying to make the schedules like, reasonable and like spacious enough that people feel relaxed when they arrive, to the hospitality. Yeah, like offering hot catering to all the artists, which, for those of us who have like toured in Europe, it's like you get that's like the baseline standard of hospitality for artists over there. And you just feel it like as soon as you arrive on my band's first European tour, we were like, oh, the morale was just like, oh, we're being treated, you feel respected, you feel valued as an artist. And we try and, as much as we can, because obviously it's not the fault of people here, it's just that the system's not really built that way, and it's hard to like fund things like that. But we do try and like prioritize that, because we know how much of a difference it makes. We do little like artist gifting and stuff, just like things that we've experienced. I take a lot of tips. I think a lot of us take tips from sort of festivals we've played, or where we felt oh, that was a really nice touch, or like this is a really nice touch. And just try and bring that kind of care into the festivals, offering non-alcoholic options for sure, because I think that's often overlooked, especially in this industry, or the only like job. I always say that you're encouraged to drink on the job, and a lot of people are, abstaining from alcohol. And I think it's important to make everybody feel included and welcome and comfortable, and feel good before they play and after they play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to know maybe what about getting behind the scenes in production, now that you've been on both sides of the stage, has identified to you in terms of what needs the Toronto music scene might have that you're aiming to fill with the festival?
From a curational perspective, we definitely notice like it's tough for local artists to connect with, more established artists, especially that are from the States or from Europe or from the UK. There's these sort of barriers that Canadian artists face that are getting more and more real all the time. Let's say touring in the US, if you're going to go try and like play, so even like do a little tour around South by. Like South by, you can go without a visa, but there's these like huge visa delays. There's these huge costs. There's these big costs to get over to Europe. And so what we're trying to facilitate are building those artist-to-artist relationships in a context where oftentimes artists are just touring through with tour support. There's not that often that locals are added, especially as the shows get bigger. So we're really trying to facilitate those connections, because really the artist-to-artist connection is one of the most important ones. They're really the ones who have the last say in who they're going to collaborate with or who they want to tour with. So I think that's a really valuable thing to emerging artists here who are facing barriers to actually, tour internationally and make those connections just, on their own organically. And in terms of, the needs of the community, I think we sort of looked at what's going on in Toronto. And there are a lot of really great, DIY sort of like grassroots events. There's event series and festivals that are happening. And we just thought this is sort of, a niche that we could carve out musically. Just sort of like, that was just taste-wise leaning into what we like musically and making it a little bit on like the weirder side. And kind of having this, like, there was always this nostalgia here about, there were these sort of like early days of North by Northeast where it really was this like, you get your backpack and like your like itinerary and you're like go hopping from show to show, and it was all over the city, but the programming was really sick, and you were really finding. I look back at newspapers of like North by in like 2008 or something, and there's like Mac DeMarco's playing at like 100 cap venue, and their curation was really like forward thinking, and it really was like the best things that were up and coming. And so we tried to, I felt like there was always this talk and this nostalgia about that kind of era. So I think in a sense, like what people missed about it was this sort of like discovery element in a way that wasn't super geared towards the industry, but just geared towards the average person that wants to go to a show, and also geared towards other artists, and not really like business to business type networking, but just like something that's just fun and about the music. And I guess that's sort of the space that we're trying to fill in the local scene.
That's great. I really like that you've carved out space for the artist to artist. I think we all begrudge saying networking, but, the artist to artist connection building. And something that I think really stands out to me on this point of, I guess, bringing it back home and trying to put a focus on investing, whether it's, financially or emotionally, community wise, in our own domestic music industry. The festival highlights a particular cluster of venues on Dundas West, and I was wanting to ask you if you could share more about what these spaces mean to the Toronto music community and what's special about them in your eyes as both an artist and a programmer.
That's a great question, because we have really great relationships with all of the venue owners in the spaces that we've used, which a lot of them we've used for most, the duration of the festival. Obviously, I spoke a little bit earlier, like I'm the booker at the Garrison, but I've worked at that venue in some capacity for like 10 years now. And the owner, Sean, has just, been a really supportive person to me, when I was bartending there, and, always letting me go on tour and have a job to come back to, very supportive of my band, and just, and he also does just a lot of, work with the city and work in the community to help spaces, music venues exist in the midst of gentrification and everything that's going on, and sound bylaws and everything else. So I think that connection, just, feeling like we're supporting businesses, and the venues are great. That's Garrison and Baby G. He owns those two. Feels really good and feels really aligned with the values and the kind of like change we want to see in the city. A big part of our mandate is also to use less traditional venue spaces. So that's where kind of like St. Anne's, which we used in 2023 as it's kind of like a rented from the folks that own the parish hall. And since then, Wavelength, which is another nonprofit presenter here, has taken that space and turned it into more of a turnkey venue. So that's been really cool to see. Now we're kind of subleasing it from them this year. But over the last couple of years, that was kind of just like a space that not a lot of people were using, that someone saw an opportunity to kind of turn it into a venue that more people can access. So that's really cool. And then 1978, which is the Expo Vintage Warehouse, which is it's the biggest venue that we use. And that's like it's a vintage store during the day. They do shows at night. It's very DIY. It's super... we bring in a PA system and everything, but I think that, using that space just really speaks to all of our sort of like backgrounds, coming up in sort of like a scrappy DIY punk scene, more or less, or, between all the organizers. I think that it feels less corporate. It feels less like, it's not like super intense, just like security and the sort of this like authoritarian presence. It just feels very welcoming, and it's a space. It's just also, it's cool to have like a multi-use space that exists in this kind of like neighborhood. It's this far down to the end of Dundas, and it's sort of like an up and coming neighborhood. So it just like feels kind of special bands. We definitely curate bands to the space, like, and we're curating bands there that are going to benefit from like playing, you know, the experience of playing in a half pipe with in a warehouse. It's a specific band that has to go there. But when you match it right, like people get extra stoked on it. When we did Lightning Bolt there, I think people, you know, when it sold out, a lot of people were urging us to move it to another venue, but I felt like people bought the ticket like for that specific experience. So that's definitely like something that we keep in mind. And you know, that's Trip in general, just like it really was. I came to Tavern Tour shortly before I started the festival, and I was actually just like really inspired by how fun that experience was. And I was just like, where in Toronto has a concentration of venues like this? And then that's kind of like where we landed. But it'll probably, you know, expand past that little neighborhood at some point. But for now, it's been working really, really well.
Yeah, you've definitely landed on a great treasure map of venues. And like you said, I think that when you do put venue and space together in a way that maybe is unconventional but still magical, it really leaves a lasting impression. Like seeing the shows at 1978 last year, for example, it was super eye opening and had me thinking about unconventional venues and how much they've contributed to my experience in the music industry. And I'm glad that people got to experience that, you know, after a period of duress in Toronto. So, Juliana, I wanted to leave you with one more question before we close things off today, which is, what do you think is something about Toronto that is underrated that people outside of Toronto might not know?
Do you want it to be music related? Like obviously I feel very strongly about like the kind of like underground music scene here, and that's obviously kind of our MO is to platform that, and there's a lot of artists here that people don't know about, which I think is important. But like if we're talking just city in general, I think people sometimes come to Toronto and are like, where should I eat? Like what are the like top, you know, 5 restaurants? And I think probably food, aside from, you know, other than music, food is definitely like a big interest of mine. So Toronto's pretty special in that like it's so multicultural that like you can find, you'd be like top 5 restaurants from like every country is what you would like find, like what type of food you want. And I miss that a lot when I'm on tour or in other places, because I think that's pretty specific and special to Toronto. It's just like food from everywhere that's like authentic and good, and sometimes honestly pretty cheap. I think maybe Toronto's like food scene is a little underrated potentially. There's a lot of like you know, we got a lot of flack. We're like I get that, but I think like what the community that we try and, you know, build up and build around and grow with is like, if people were to come and see Toronto through the lens of like a festival like this, or you know, similar to Project Nowhere, then I think it, like, I've had people that come to the festival and sort of like have a fondness for Toronto after sort of like seeing it in a way where you're not just like downtown and in this crazy place, but rather like maybe through the lens of like there's already like a little community here. I think some people would be surprised to just see how accepting and sweet and supportive it actually can be as a city.
100%. I know that was definitely the experience it left me with last year when I visited for the first time in, I don't know, like 10 years, which is really embarrassing to say, but I hadn't been to Toronto in a really long time. And I know that it left me with a fondness and wanting to go back. So mission accomplished. Do you have any recommendations for food that you could find along the Project Nowhere strip?
Ooh, on the strip for sure. Pinata Tacos is like a hot spot that's right across from Baby G. I literally ate there yesterday. And that's like, Toronto does not have very much good Mexican food, so to recommend that, it's like that's actually pretty decent. And there's a really good banh mi place by the Garrison. I'm forgetting the name, but it's like a tiny hole in the wall. Hanmoto is really good for like a little bit more like, it's kind of like Asian fusion, but like slightly more like upscale snacks and cocktails. It's a pretty bumping area, but maybe those would be my like 3 recommendations off the top of my head.
Awesome. Looking forward to the festival this year, Juliana. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Thanks, Zoe.